A suspension of mercy. 12. Mrs. Edward Ponsonby, otherwise Alicia, had installed herself in Brighton at a larger and more comfortable hostelry than the bed and breakfast place she had been in before, where the curfew, or the landlady's retiring time, had been 10 p.m, according to a sign inside the front door. She was in a real hotel now, the Sinclair, though it was a modest one and she had no private bath. Her monthly cheque of £50 had come in July 2nd, the day she had left home, so she had cashed it in Ipswich. She and Sydney had a joint account at the Ipswich Bank with about £100 in it, but she didn't want to write cheques on that and deprive Sydney, and a cheque would also betray where she was. She intended to live on her £50 as long as it lasted, then perhaps take a job as a clerk somewhere, not in London, but in a small town with a restful atmosphere. Her bill at the end of a week at the Hotel Sinclair had diminished her resources by 9 guineas, but her meals out cost very little, and she thought she might last until her next cheque, and from cheque to cheque. But she foresaw that life might become boring without a job. And how to get the next cheque was a slight problem, because it would come to Ronsey Knoll, and Sydney wouldn't know where to forward it, and she did not want to tell her bank, and consequently Sydney, where she was. Her personal post was not important. She could let that go. Also, it would look as if she really had disappeared off the face of the earth if she took no interest in her post, and therefore Sydney could play his games. She supposed he would act as guilty as possible, as if he had really murdered her, and irritate everyone. Just how far he went, Alicia thought, would be a good indication of his sanity and maturity. She had some misgivings about both. She thought of ringing Edward Tilbury one evening, or some Sunday afternoon. She might ask him, really not caring whether he came or not, he might have an all-absorbing interest in London by now, if he would like to come down on a weekend. Alicia played with several fantasies. Edward would come down some Saturday and they would register at an hotel under another name, maybe Ponsonby, and they'd have a wicked weekend. Or Edward would spend another Saturday with her, and a real love would develop between them, causing her to do something drastic, like divorce Sydney. Or a passionate love affair would start. Edward would wangle a month's leave from his firm and they'd take a cottage somewhere. Or Edward might commute to London to his job and spend the nights and weekends in Brighton. In case of a long affair, it was wiser if they took a cottage outside of Brighton, because some of their London friends might realise they were both missing and draw a conclusion and think of Brighton because people knew she liked it. Alicia was obsessed with the colour blue now, and she had bought sheets of heavy blue paper, which she cut into 6 by 8 inch rectangles. With these in a drawing pad, her fountain pen that drew in India ink, and a single-colour pencil, a red one, she sat for hours on the beach and promenade benches, making abstract drawings of the scene around her. She was inspired to send a few of them to Mrs. Lilybanks, but she didn't. She did not want even Mrs. Lilybanks to know where she was. Mrs. Lilybanks would naturally tell Sydney. Sydney might think she was in Brighton, but Alicia didn't want him to be sure of it. 2 weeks passed, and Alicia felt much calmer and happier. She imagined her parents being a little worried about her, but she thought Sydney could smooth that over. Her parents should realise that if anything serious happened to her, it would be in the newspapers. But in the 3rd week, Alicia grew tired of the speckled strawberry sundaes in tall glasses at the Eclair, of the scallopini at the Italian restaurant, of the rotten pastry in the tea shops that she could afford, and she even grew tired of her 4 walls in the Hotel Sinclair, papered with a tiny boat design, pink on cream, which had looked so delightful at first because the room was new to her and her own. One evening she indulged in 2 double gins in a pub in Steen Street, and at the end of the 2nd she rang Edward in London. Edward was in, rather to her surprise, and she took it as a favourable omen. It was all arranged in an incredibly short time, even before the first 3 minutes had run out. Edward would come down the following Saturday morning, on the 10 a.m. train, which arrived at 11, and he would stay over Saturday night and Sunday. He sounded extremely pleased that she had rung him. She met him at the railway station, nearly missed him among the people getting off because he seemed to be ducking his head, and he also seemed shorter than she remembered. But his happy, open smile was the same when he saw her. He swept his hat off and kissed her on one cheek. They had a drink in the buffet of the station. "I suppose you think I'm mad," Alicia said, "but I'm taking another vacation, a longer one this time, and doing quite a bit of drawing. I brought my oil paints, too." "My dear, I think you're delightful," Edward said. "What's mad about it?" From that, and his tone, she knew he would not tell any of his London friends he had seen her, and would not ask anything about Sydney. "Where are you stopping?" "At the Hotel Sinclair," Alicia answered. "Nothing grand, but it's quite adequate." "Would you object if I took a room there? Or would you prefer me to go to another hotel?" He smiled his boyish, shy smile. "It's so much easier for us to meet if we're under the same roof." "Of course I don't mind. I should think the Sinclair's big enough for both of us." Edward had a hold-all with him, which contained a shirt, swimming trunks, and pyjamas, he said. So they went to the hotel from the station, and Alicia explained that because she didn't want Sydney or her parents to know where she was, she had registered under another name, Mrs. Edward Ponsonby. "I hope you don't mind the Edward," she said. "I'm pleased," said Edward Tilbury. Alicia had no intention of starting an affair with Edward, really, so she didn't. Edward was obviously willing. She felt guilty about having asked him down to Brighton without sleeping with him, but curiously he seemed to be content with the situation. They spent a Saturday afternoon and evening and Sunday as pleasant as their first Sunday, and Alicia gave him an antique tie-pin which she had bought in a spare moment on Saturday afternoon. She did not say anything about when they might see each other next, but Edward asked if she would be in Brighton next weekend. Alicia said she thought she would be, and Edward asked if he might come down again. "Yes, I'd love it, if you've nothing better to do," she added automatically. But she loved Edward at that moment, and he had never come nearer to possessing her. 13. At the end of July, when Alicia had been gone nearly 4 weeks, the Polk Faradays came up to Suffolk for a weekend with Sydney. Sydney was working out the plot of his third whip story, The Second Sir Quentin, which concerned the whip's impersonation of an English diplomat. It was Sydney's first entertaining, apart from the Inez and Carpi picnic, since Alicia had left, and with unwonted enthusiasm he bought a chicken, a roast, a bottle of Hague, several bottles of wine, and all kinds of delicatessen from a shop in Ipswich. The Polk Faradays arrived at 8:30 p.m. Friday, and Sydney greeted them at the back door. They contributed ale, wine, and a couple of custard pies made by Hitty. "This is going to be a great weekend," Sydney said, fixing the first drinks in the kitchen. "Yes, it's raining already," Alex said, though not gloomily. Hitty said, "May I? It smells super," and opened the oven door. "Mm-mm. Want me to mash some potatoes?" Sydney was cooking the roast beef. "The potatoes are done, if you want to mash them." Hitty did. "You're looking well," Alex said. "Bachelor life agrees with you." "Oh, I don't know." Sydney recalled that Mrs. Lillybanks had said the same thing a few days ago. The prospect of the sale of the whip had picked him up tremendously, but he didn't want to say that to Alex for fear it would bring bad luck. Hitty came in with her drink, looked around the living room, and bent to admire the yellow roses Sydney had put into the cracked white vase in front of the fireplace. "Oh, isn't this a different carpet?" Hitty asked. Sydney started a little, as he had when Mrs. Lillybanks mentioned the carpet. "Yes, we thought the other was getting pretty cruddy." He glanced at Alex, causing Alex to look at him. "We picked this up very cheaply at a second-hand place." "It's nice." Hitty looked from the carpet up at Sydney. "Any news from Alicia?" "No, I'm not expecting to hear from her, you know. She really does want to be alone for a while. It's annoying, in a way, because her mother keeps expecting me to hear from her, and apparently Alicia isn't writing to her mother either." Sydney shrugged, a way he was talking at too great a length, simply because it had been 3 or 4 days since the last time he had seen Mrs. Lillybanks, since he had said 20 consecutive words to anyone, even shopkeepers. "Where do you think she is?" Hitty asked. "Brighton," Sydney said. "He's done away with her," said Alex, getting up with his empty glass, going toward the kitchen. He winked one eye and kept it shut, peering with the other into Sydney's face. "He's done her in. He's going to live off her income, and he's going to stick the story of the murder in the Whip series and make a mint on it." Sydney laughed politely. "You're not worried about Alicia?" Hitty said, rather than asked. But her blonde Chinese face looked worried. Her brown-penciled brows moved in straight, slanting lines and nearly met over her nose. "No, I don't see any reason to be," Sidney said. "And how long will she be gone?" Sidney had a feeling Hitty was pumping him for information she intended to pass on to interested parties in London. "I suppose," he said, "it could be 6 months. Alicia said she wasn't sure how long she wanted to be away. I don't want to say that to her mother because the Sneezums, achoo, might really get worried. They don't understand the younger generation." Sidney took Hitty's glass and went off to the kitchen with it. It wasn't empty, but he wanted to be a good host. Sidney spent the last part of the dinner telling them about the second Sir Quentin. "When the story opens," Sidney said, "Sir Quentin Ogilvy, KCMG GCB, which stands for Grand Crashing Bore, is assassinated by a bomb thrown at him in the dark street in Ankara. We'll show the bomb sequence first, before we know anything about anybody. Bang! Sir Quentin is just leaving the house of one of his mistresses. It's crucial that Sir Quentin makes an appearance in London at a diplomatic conference, therefore crucial that neither the Turkish nor the English officials know he's been killed. This is where the whip—" "Why?" asked Alex, sitting sideways in his chair, legs crossed. "Because of diplomatic conditions in Turkey versus England at that moment. The valet of Sir Quentin, who is no fool, hears about the death through a street urchin, who comes to Sir Quentin's house. The valet and the urchin get the body off the street in the darkness and hide it in Sir Quentin's garage under some tarpaulins. Then the valet makes a call to London, to the CID. The CID contacts one of their middlemen, that is, with whom they have no further connection, a blind alley." "Mm-hmm," Alex said, looking down sleepily and dubiously at his plate, mopping the last sauce with a last bite of roast beef. Hitty, at least, seemed to be following him, so Sidney continued. "We see the whip in his London flat, talking to the middleman who's just rung up. The whip smiles and says he'll do the job, though we don't know what the job is. Meanwhile, back in Ankara, we see the Turkish assassins looking sore and puzzled because their assassination plan has apparently failed. There's Sir Quentin walking around town, hale as ever, except for a bandage over part of his head and one eye, presumably from the bomb. It's the whip, assuming a perfect disguise as the old GCB Sir Quentin." Hitty was taking away the dishes on tiptoe, listening, bringing in the pie. Sidney heard the coffee perking behind him in the kitchen. He went on. "Plenty of opportunity for comedy in this, Alex. We can have one of Sir Quentin's luscious mistresses turning up on his threshold, missing him, you know, and not taking no for an answer. But if the whip sleeps with her, he's afraid it might reveal the fact he's not the old Grand Crashing Bore, as indeed it might." Sidney gave a clap of laughter, and was pleased by Hitty's giggle. "Mm-hmm," said Alex, smiling but close-mouthed. His eyes looked a trifle drunk, or perhaps were merely bloodshot from driving. "Every now and then we flash to the tarpaulins in Sir Quentin's garage. The garageman comes to correct a faulty taillight on the rolls, for instance. The valet hovers around, stopping the garageman from taking one of the tarpaulins to lie on when he's crawling under the car. Something like that." "I'm lost," Alex complained. "Oh, it'll be better on paper. You won't be lost then. It's a simple story, like all good stories," Sidney said. "I'm not lost. Go on," Hitty said, sitting down at her place. She had distributed the pie on plates with fresh forks. "Well, Ogilvy, alias the Whip—" "You mean the Whip, alias Ogilvy," said Alex. "Any way you like," said Sidney. "He comes to London, with pomp and protocol for the conference, does his part brilliantly, saves the conference, averts war, and so forth." Sidney trailed off, for in fact he hadn't gotten beyond this. "It needs a good wind-up at the end, and the tarpaulins in the garage." Sidney stared at the centre of the table for a moment, thought of the red and blue rug he had buried, the inside-out rolled rug with Alicia's body in it. What did one do with a body besides bury it? "I suppose it'll have to be buried somewhere finally." "Mm-hmm. By whom?" asked Alex, starting on his pie. "By the valet and a couple of chums like the street urchins. They all know an international crisis has been averted. They'll play along with a little thing like getting rid of the body." "Of course, later Ogilvy'll be missed. I presume the Whip stays on in London?" Alex asked. "Oh, sure. Ready for our next story," Sidney said. "Ogilvy'll finally be missed, but we don't have to show that. By then the crisis is over." "What crisis?" "Alex," Hitty said reproachfully, "you might give Sidney the courtesy of listening." "I am listening. "I didn't get the crisis," Alex said, lifting his long, pale face, one black brow frowning as he looked at his wife. "I haven't the foggiest what the crisis is about, and I don't think Sydney has." Hitty sighed deploringly, with a glance at Sydney. They were all tired, even with a second pot of coffee, which Sydney made to help Hitty and him get through the dishes. Alex was plainly too exhausted to help. In the kitchen, Hitty said, "I hope you'll forgive Alex for being grumpy tonight. He's had a hard week, working late 3 nights, and then the drive." "Oh, think nothing of it," Sydney said cheerfully. "He was kidding me, I know." His hands were deep in soapsuds. "The big bowls go here?" Hitty asked. She was drying and putting away at the same time. "Dear girl, I don't give a damn where you put them. I'd like them in a different place for a change." When Hitty returned for the next dish in the rack, she said, "It must be awfully lonely for you here without Alicia. I think you're bearing up wonderfully." Sydney turned his still slightly smiling face toward her. He was bearing up superbly, but he realized that with extroverts and togetherness people like the Polk Faradays, one wasn't supposed to be superbly happy alone. "No, I like it. I'm not lonely. Don't forget, I was an only child. I'm used to being alone." And it was hard for Sydney to understand why people chose to live in groups sometimes, like big Italian families, for example, unless out of economic necessity. Crowds troubled him. A mass of people standing in a cinema lobby waiting to go inside troubled him emotionally. Their assemblage seemed to have some hostile intent, like the assemblage of men for an army. Assembly did not seem to Sydney a condition normal people should desire. He was an ochlophobe. But Hitty's face still registered sympathetic concern. "Alex was saying, Alicia gets a monthly income, doesn't she?" She was about to say, Sydney thought, "If Alicia's dead, it'll go to you, won't it?" He smiled a little. "Yes, it's due the 1st of August, Monday." "It comes through the post to her?" "Yes, comes in the 2nd. Hitty stood on one foot and scratched the bottom of her other foot. She had removed her new sandals after dinner because they pinched, and now she was bare-legged and barefooted. "If it doesn't come," Alex was saying, "you could write the bank or ring them and ask where Alicia told them to forward it. I suppose she's told them." "I'm sure she has. But I don't think Alicia wants me to know where she is. It was an agreement between us. She wanted absolute privacy, you see?" Sydney hoped that was the end of it. "But aren't you curious?" "No," Sydney said, and pulled the plug out of the sink. He remembered the dirty coffee pot and quickly put the plug in again. He banged the grounds out in the box destined for the compost heap, washed the pot, scoured the sink with Ajax, dried his hands, then lifted one of Hitty's hands to his lips and said, "Thank you, my sweet. How about a nightcap?" "Oh, no, I couldn't. Thanks." Sydney didn't have one either. 15 minutes later, he was asleep in the double bed in the bedroom. He woke up at the sound of an amorous pigeon, ooh, 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 so loud that it might have been in the room with him. He went downstairs and put on coffee. Then he went up to his study, put a sheet of paper into the typewriter and wrote, "The Second Sir Quentin, Act 1, and began to bang away. After 20 minutes and 2 cups of coffee, he had 3.5 pages of synopsis with a crystal-clear government crisis. Around 9, he woke the Polk Faradays up with cups of coffee on a tray, then got his synopsis from his study. "Take a look at this, if you like. I think it's clearer." Sydney had perceived, by the dawn's early light, that his story lacked a middle part, so he provided it by having the assassins make further attempts on the Whip, who they of course thought to be the real Sir Quentin. The Whip outwitted and at last captured the little band of assassins before flying off for the London conference. Sydney went down to see about breakfast. Alex came down a few minutes later and said he thought the story was quite interesting. "I didn't really get it last night. Sorry, old boy. I was bushed. It might be the best of the 3 so far." After breakfast, Sydney and Alex drove off to Framlingham, and Sydney bought charcoal and a thick steak. He was inspired to make a charcoal pit. Hitty put their grocery purchases away when they got home, and Sydney went out to the tool house for the pitchfork. Alex followed him, curious to see how a pit was made. Sydney plunged the pitchfork into the tough, grassy soil and prized up the first clump. The pitchfork, Sydney noticed, had darker-coloured and now dry lumps of earth stuck high up between its tines, soil from the place where he had buried Alicia. And it seemed to him Alex was looking at the pitchfork with a speculative frown, and that he was going to make some comment about it in the next moment. "How deep do they have to be?" Alex asked. "About a foot. They can be very deep, but then they're big for roasting whole animals. I'm just making this for steaks." Alex was just as amiable all day as he had been grouchy the previous evening. They spent a productive couple of hours in the sun after lunch, talking over the story and arranging it in 3 acts and about 20 scenes. Meanwhile, Alex was ready to start typing up the second whip script. Sidney knew he'd be a good 2 weeks in the typing. "If you'd post it to me," Sidney said, "I'll type it." "Oh, there are always little last-minute changes I have to make. You know how it is." Sidney sighed, impatience for the acceptance. "We really won't know anything before the end of August, will we?" "You mean from Plummer?" "Probably not. I don't think I can get this third one done before the end of August, and he wanted 3 finished." Sidney swatted a gnat that had just stung his forearm. "How about me trying to write Sir Quentin? We've got it so well laid out." Better not, Sid. We're doing so well like this. Let's not take a chance." Sidney said nothing. He was a little annoyed by Alex's proprietary attitude. The ideas, after all, came from him. And why should Alex have a monopoly on playwriting? Sidney got up and said, "Let's have a drink. Sun's way over the yardarm and practically in the sea." They were all on second drinks by the time Sidney struck a match to his charcoal, on which he had poured some fuel to make it light instantly. It did light instantly, and the flaming bowl in the earth pleased him tremendously. Hitty wrapped the potatoes in foil and baked them on the coals. They were all very merry, and Sidney sang for them. "Under the breeches of Paris with you, I'll make your screams come true." Hitty screamed with laughter, and Sidney did too, because he was making up the words as he went along. He hoped they didn't carry to Mrs. Lilybank's. "You see, bachelor life suits him," Alex said to Hitty. "I never saw him this cheerful when Alicia was around." "Oh, Alex," Hitty said, ready to defend the sacred bliss of matrimony. "Aren't you more cheerful, Sid?" Alex asked. "That's right. No more hidden bananas and stuff like that. And just wait till her income starts pouring in. Boy, that plus the whip, I'll be rolling." Sidney was on one knee, testing the heat of the coals with his palm. "Hidden bananas?" Hitty asked. Her accent broadened every A. "Alicia likes them, he corrected, less ripe than I do. So to get any ripe before she eats them, I had to hide them behind books and things. Then every 6 months or so, when Alicia would dust the books, she'd say, 'Eek, good God, another banana. What a state it's in.'" Hitty and Alex roared. "Hidden bananas," Hitty kept saying, leaning on Alex to keep her balance. "Hitty was saying, you can tell where Alicia is from where she told her bank to send her income, can't you?" Alex asked. "Yes, but as I was saying to Hitty, I don't think Alicia wants me to know." Hitty must have told him that, Sidney thought, and he didn't want to go into it again. He didn't want to talk about Alicia at all. "You will let us know if she collects her cheque, won't you, Sid?" Alex asked. "Sure. If she collects it? I'm sure she'll collect it. She'll need it." Unless she was staying with some friend, Sidney thought. But he couldn't imagine who it might be. He didn't think it was anyone in London, and she didn't know any people well enough anywhere outside of London to stay with. A couple of married school friends, yes, but Alicia wouldn't want to stay with them, he was certain. He got to his feet. "While there's some light, I want to look for a grill," he said, and went off to the tool house. When he came back with a square of criss-crossed wire, just the thing, Hitty and Alex were having a murmured conversation. "You have a joint bank account, haven't you, Sid?" Alex asked. "You could tell—" "Yes, but she wouldn't take everything out of that and leave me flat." They ate indoors, but the glowing orange coals in the pit drew them out again later, and they sat long around it, Hitty sipping coffee, Sidney and Alex finishing the wine. Sidney was trying to think of a fourth story for the whip. 14. The Polk Faradays had been right to attach such importance to Alicia's collecting her income, Sidney discovered. Alicia's cheque arrived from the Westminster Bank on August the 2nd, Tuesday, and only half an hour after its delivery, before 9 o'clock, Mrs. Sneesham rang up to ask if the cheque had come. Sidney said it had, but that he didn't know where to send it. "It must mean Alicia intends to come home soon," Mrs. Sneesham said. "I was hoping she might be back now, because I rang the Westminster Bank a couple of days ago and was told she hadn't given any forwarding address. Have you heard from her?" "No." "Neither have we. What about your bank in Ipswich? Has she been drawing money out of that?" Sidney didn't know, and Mrs. Sneesham seemed surprised and annoyed that he hadn't bothered to find out. She asked if he would ring the bank and ask, and then ring her back, collect, and Sidney said that he would. Then he waited, feeling somehow like a reproached child and resenting it, until 9:30, which he thought was the earliest possible hour to call a bank. It was a boring, embarrassing chore. Never mind, he told himself, if you'd killed her, you'd have to be going through the same motions. People in your stories have to do it all the time, and this is what it feels like. He called the Ipswich Bank. It took several minutes to get the right clerk to find this information, and then the news was that no cheques signed by Mrs. Bartleby had come in since June 26th, and that was a cheque dated June 24th. Alicia had left on July 2nd. Sidney called Mrs. Sneesham back and reported. "Really? I wonder what she's doing for money, or if something's actually happened to her." "Well, she went off with £50 from her July cheque. It had just come in, and she cashed it in Ipswich." "Yes, I suppose she did. But it's not like Alicia not to want her money as soon as she can get it. Not to run out of money, either." 3 days later, on a shopping expedition in Ipswich, he called at the bank and asked again. No cheques signed by Mrs. Bartleby had come in. That was on a Friday. Who was keeping her? Sidney wondered. A man? What man? The telephone was ringing as Sidney got back home. It was Mrs. Sneesham. Sidney told her his lack of news. "My husband thinks it's time we asked the police to look for her, and so do I. I think you'll agree too, Sidney," she said in a matter-of-fact and somewhat impatient tone. "I'm sure when the police hear the story, they'll wonder why we haven't spoken to them weeks before." Sidney felt this was a direct slap at him, but only agreed politely that they should ask for police help. "I think the police should start with Brighton and go on from there, if they have to," Mrs. Sneesham said. "We might need a couple of photographs, if she's doing something silly like staying somewhere under another name, you know. Perhaps you can post me some, Sidney, a couple of clear ones. You probably have some that are more up-to-date than the ones we've got here." It took him half an hour to find 2 snapshots that showed Alicia's face clearly, one of her in jeans in a deck chair behind the house, the other in a summer dress, from last year, standing by the apple tree between their house and Mrs. Lilybank's. "Suffolk girl found murdered," Sidney imagined the headline over it. No. "Have you seen her? Police suspect foul play." Oh, rot, he thought, and went into his workshop to get an envelope. Interesting that the Sneeshams didn't trust him to call in the police and get things moving properly. Sidney drove to the Roncy Knoll post office with the envelope. He needed some jam, so after dropping the envelope into the box outside the door, he went into the store. It was a combined post office and general store, not very big. "Some orange marmalade, please, Mr. Fowler," Sidney said, thinking that by tomorrow or the next day Mr. Fowler wouldn't go off for his purchase so quickly, but would stop and say, "Oh, Mr. Bartleby, I saw about your wife in the paper." Sidney had told Mr. Fowler and also Edith, his daughter who helped out, and also Rutledge, the handyman, and the milkman who had asked about Alicia last week, and even Fred Hartung at the garage in Roncy Knoll where he bought most of his gas. He had said to all of them that Alicia was in Kent with her mother. Now it would come out in the papers that he had known for about 3 weeks that Alicia wasn't with her mother, yet he had kept on giving out that story. Mrs. Lilybanks knew, and had known since the Inez and Carpi picnic, Sidney realised. She must not have told anybody in the neighbourhood, which was nice of her. "Thick cut, right?" Mr. Fowler asked, thunking the jar down. He was a tallish, slender man with a bushy black moustache, rather like Rudyard Kipling's. "Right," Sidney said, pleased that he remembered his preference. "All right like that?" Mr. Fowler asked, meaning should he wrap it. "Oh, certainly. Nothing else to carry." With a wave, Sidney walked toward the door. "I hope Mrs. Bartleby's keeping all right," said Mr. Fowler. Sidney turned. "I think she's all right. She's not much for writing," he said, looking Mr. Fowler in the eye. Then he went on. Just what a killer would say, Sidney thought. August 2nd, Tuesday. Sidney looked at the date on the calendar. contributed by their Framlingham dairy, 2 Scotty pups in plaid collars in the picture, and he felt it would have profound significance for him. Nothing would happen today, but today was a turning point because of the entry of the police. It was also the day he intended to send off a carbon of The Planners to Potter and Desh in London. He had sent the original by surface mail to his agent in New York 10 days ago, but because London was more immediate and personally important, he had kept his second copy and continued to look at it, though without changing anything. Just before 6 p.m, when the post office closed, Sidney wrote a covering letter to Potter and Desh, wrapped the manuscript, and sent it. The next morning at 10, a young police constable knocked on Sidney's door. He was blond, fresh-faced, and very earnest behind his smile. He pulled out a tablet and fountain pen, and Sidney offered him a chair. He sat down stiffly and prepared to write on his knees. "It's about your wife. Have you heard anything from her?" "Not a thing," Sidney said. He sat down on the sofa. The first questions were of the kind Sidney anticipated. The date he had seen her last? July 2nd. Where? He had put her on the train to London at Ipswich that morning, Saturday, around 11:30 a.m. Where did she say she was going? She said to her mother's. What kind of mood had she been in? In quite a good mood. She was going to do some painting, and she wanted to be by herself for a while. Wasn't it unusual that she hadn't written a word to him or to anyone since? No, not really, because she had said she wouldn't write to him until she wanted to come back, and she asked him not to try to communicate with her. But wasn't it unusual that she hadn't even written to her mother? Perhaps it was. Sidney rubbed his palms together slowly between his knees and waited attentively for the next questions. "The police are looking around Brighton now, but it's important that we get some information from you too. Do you know any other places she might have gone?" "I can't think of any." "Did she say how long she might be away?" "Not specifically. She said, no matter how long I'm gone, that she didn't want me to try to find her. I gathered it could be months, maybe 6 months." "Really?" He wrote it down. "She said that?" "She said she didn't know." Sidney shrugged a little, nervously. "She took 2 suitcases with her and some of her winter clothes. She thought some time apart might do us both good," Sidney said, feeling himself sliding deeper into suspicious-sounding replies, perfectly truthful replies, yet he was doing what murderers always did, say their victims had said they would be absent for an indefinite length of time. "In that case, maybe there's not so much reason for Mrs. Bartleby's parents to be worried," said the constable. "No, and I suppose something's in the papers this morning. I only saw the Times. If my wife knows her family's so concerned, she'll communicate. Probably today. It's in the papers this morning with a photograph. It's in the Express. Mrs. Bartleby's parents don't know she might stay away as long as 6 months?" the young constable asked with a frown. "I don't know. I didn't tell her mother that for fear she might be more worried. Also because I wasn't sure Alicia really would stay away that long. But now that her mother's already upset, Sidney stopped, floundering. Another gaffe, another boner, he thought. Why hadn't he told Mrs. Sneesham? Because he was lying. Because he had made up the whole story and hadn't planned carefully enough to tell everyone the same story. The constable stood up. "I think that's all we have to ask you for the moment, Mr. Bartleby. Let's hope today, with the publicity, she'll answer from somewhere." Sidney went back upstairs to his study, then, on an impulse, went into the bedroom and looked out its front window. The young constable was on the road's edge by his bicycle, looking at his notes. Then he turned his bicycle, mounted it, and pedalled off toward Mrs. Lilybank's house, where he dismounted, parked his bicycle, and approached her front door. And had the neighbours seen anything suspicious lately around the Bartleby house? Sidney did not stand at the window waiting to see when the officer came out, but when he looked again 10 minutes later, the bicycle was still leaning against the front gate-post. Mrs. Lilybanks might have seen him carrying out the carpet, of course. Sidney had thought of that before. But he hadn't really thought that the police would be called in. Not really. Alicia might have had enough consideration to write her parents, he thought. She could have told them not to tell him where she was, if she wanted to keep it a secret. Sidney felt vaguely guilty and ashamed of himself. It was neither a pleasant nor an interesting sensation. Mrs. Lilybanks was glad to talk to someone about Alicia, but she hadn't known that anything was in the newspapers that day, that people were alarmed because Alicia was missing, and when she heard that, Mrs. Lillybanks thought she should be careful about saying how surprised she was at not hearing anything from her. There was no use in adding to the alarm. "Would you say you know the Bartlebys pretty well?" the young officer asked after he had finished with some preliminary questions. "No, just as neighbours. I've been here only since the end of May. Alicia and I did a little painting together." The officer glanced at the green smock she wore over her dress. "You've seen Mr. Bartleby a few times since his wife's been gone?" "Oh, yes. He's been here for dinner, and I went over to his house for a picnic one afternoon." She could have said more about that afternoon. That it was the afternoon she learned that Alicia wasn't at her parents', about 3 weeks ago, and that her London friends had been surprised by that fact. But Mrs. Lillybanks thought it best not to prattle. "Did he seem worried about her?" "Not a bit. She did want to stay away for a while, she said." "She said? Or Mr. Bartleby said?" "She said it. Alicia came by to see me the Thursday or Friday before the Saturday she left. I suppose it was Friday. She said she wanted to be by herself for a while and paint, and she thought a little solitude might do her husband good too." The officer nodded. "She was in good spirits?" "Quite good, yes." "Have you heard from her?" "Oh, no. I'd have told Mr. Bartleby if I had." "Did you expect to hear from her?" "I did. Really," said Mrs. Lillybanks carefully. "But she may not be able to write easily, even a postcard, and she may really want to cut everything off for a while." "Do you think they were getting along all right, the Bartlebys? It might be a help as to what Mrs. Bartleby decided to do with herself, take a job under another name or go to another country like. I didn't ask Mr. Bartleby that, because I could see he meant to say they were getting along very well, just decided to separate for 6 months." "6 months?" Mrs. Lillybanks asked. "That's what Mr. Bartleby said. He wouldn't be surprised if it was 6 months she was gone, he said. Mrs. Bartleby didn't say that to you?" "No, I'm sure she didn't, or I'd have remembered. I got the idea she'd be away a few weeks, perhaps about a month." Mrs. Lillybanks was sitting up alertly on her sofa with her hands crossed in her lap. "Well." He made a short note in his tablet. He was perched on a hassock with his long legs pressed together to make a writing place. "Do you mind telling me how they were getting on, you think?" Mrs. Lillybanks chose her words. "I think well enough. I saw them together with other people, as I said." And she had seen Sidney's temper in the kitchen that evening too. A shocking flare of temper, but was it logical to attach great importance to that? "You noticed nothing unusual around the time Mrs. Bartleby left?" Mrs. Lillybanks jumped slightly and resettled herself. She had a vision of Sidney carrying something heavy over his shoulder in the garden the morning after the day Alicia had left, or was supposed to have left. Very early it had been, still hardly daylight. She had been trying to bird-watch with her binoculars, but since it was still not light enough, though the birds were singing, she had gone downstairs to start her tea-water. When she had looked out the upstairs window again, Sidney's car had been moving off down the road. "No," she said. "Nothing unusual." "Mrs. Bartleby didn't say anything unusual to you, like she was going to meet anybody?" "No," said Mrs. Lillybanks. 15. For 2 days, August 4th and 5th, the Daily Express and the Evening Standard ran a photograph, a different one on different days, of Alicia Bartleby. The captions read, "Seen her," and "Still missing," and "Search continues," and "Where is she?" The short items below stated that Mrs. Alicia Bartleby, 26, of Ronsinol, Suffolk, had gone off, presumably to her parents' home in Kent on July 2nd, but had not arrived there and had not been heard from since. Her husband now believed she was in Brighton, and the police were making a search of the Brighton area. On Thursday, when the first photographs appeared, Edward Tilbury was to come down to Brighton by train and take the bus to Arundel, on whose outskirts he and Alicia had rented a small house. It was Edward's birthday, otherwise he would not have made the trip in mid-week. He usually came down Friday evening and stayed until Monday morning. Edward came down, though he was quite shaken by the photographs in the morning and evening newspapers, and his detraining at Brighton and boarding of the Arundel bus had been more furtive than usual. He was even more upset by the change in Alicia's appearance. She had taken the scooter to Littlehampton that afternoon, she said, and got her hair cut and tinted at a beauty parlour there. She had baked a cake, with pink icing and candles, as yet unlit, which stood on the coffee table. "Happy birthday, darling. Don't you like it?" she asked, running her fingers through her hair in a gay, upward gesture. "Yes, it's all right. I gather you saw the papers. What are you going to do, darling? Why don't you sit down?" "You're not sitting down." "Of course I've seen the papers. I was going to make you a drink. I've got a surprise for dinner. I hope you can't tell what it is from the smell." She went off to the kitchen. Edward laid his briefcase down. He had brought a brief to study and was glad he had got through most of it on the train. He had hoped to find Alicia sobered and a little frightened, in which case he would have comforted her and tried to persuade her to go to her parents. She had had a couple of drinks, he could tell. Alicia came back with a scotch and soda for him and for herself. "Cheers, darling, and happy returns." He stared at her reddish hair. He supposed it was what they called auburn. It was certainly on the red side. "You're not even going to kiss me?" He kissed her, on the cheek, then the lips. "How's your foot, darling?" "Oh, it's all right," Edward said, baring his teeth briefly in a grimace. He had trodden on a piece of glass Sunday on the beach. His foot wasn't infected, he had made quite sure of that by frequent examinations and doctoring of it, but he had to limp a little to spare it, and at the office he had had to say he trod on a drawing pin, barefoot, at home. "I gather you have no intention of telling anybody where you are?" "No, dear, I haven't. But I would like to leave here. I was thinking of Angmering. It's also on the sea and a little closer to Brighton for the bus." Alicia smiled. "It certainly will look odd. You're changing your hair? Just today?" Alicia sat down on the brown velour sofa and pulled Edward down beside her. "Don't be nervy, darling. By the time people start looking for me, what do you think they'll see? This." She held a 4-inch length of hair up from the top of her head. "Alicia, I'm not so sure it's wise. As for myself, I can't afford to be dragged into some silly business of deceiving the police for a love affair." "Is that all it is?" "Oh, you know I want to marry you. But this isn't the way to begin. You don't want me to begin by losing my position, do you?" he asked with a nervous laugh. "I admit I was damned uneasy coming down here this evening." "Oh, Edward, I'll give you courage. Now look, if we move from here tomorrow, I can move what little we've got here, never fear. We'll lose only 5 days of the fortnight's rent we've paid. That's of no importance. Money is always important. I'll ring you tomorrow in the office and tell you where I've— Dearest, don't ever ring me in the office. I've told you that before." "All right. I'll meet you at the Brighton station tomorrow at 7, or 6:30, or whenever." Edward said nothing, and tried to remain calm, or become calm. He had the feeling Alicia didn't mean anything she was saying, or rather, that she couldn't carry through anything she was saying, even if she meant to. She would give him courage. When she was so full of anxieties, even about his driving, that she had made him stop driving down to Brighton. Alicia was afraid to go more than 20 miles an hour on the scooter, too, and he'd had a hard time convincing her that they needed one down here, though Alicia had a license to drive one that dated from when she was 19. The license was under the name of Alicia Sneesham. Edward took a deep pull on his drink, then said, "And how long is it going to go on?" "Oh, maybe a few more weeks. Darling, don't you think we have a happy life?" She caressed his right hand. It was happy. Still is. She leaned closer to him, put her arm around his neck and kissed him. It was a long, beautiful kiss. Edward relaxed. Yes, it still was a happy life, he supposed. Alicia was the most exciting woman he had ever been to bed with. Edward did not forget that. "It's only the police that bother me," he said, when the kiss was over. "But what do you want me to do about them?" Alicia asked helplessly. "Can't you, for instance, instead of going to Angmering tomorrow, go home to Kent? Tell your parents you've been in some little towns around Brighton painting. Apologise for not writing to them. Tell them you want a divorce from Sydney, and then tell Sydney. And leave me out of it till then." Alicia felt vaguely hurt. Edward wasn't in the spirit of the thing at all. "You'd think there was something illegal about what we're doing." Edward gave a laugh. Darling, there is. And it's worse, with the police in it. If I do what you suggested, I won't be able to see you or be with you for months and months. That was true. Edward was silenced for a moment, torn. Alicia went into the kitchen to attend to the dinner.